Great pleasure to introduce you all to Marty Sulek. Marty is a scholar with wide-ranging interest in the humanities, spanning philosophy, history, classical studies, political theory, and philology. He specializes in the study of philanthropy, or in the humanistic study of philanthropy, to be more precise, applying knowledge and understanding in these fields to shed light on both the concept of and the practice of what people have been calling philanthropy over the centuries and millennia, as a matter of fact. Marty is among the first to earn a PhD in philanthropy studies at the Lilly School in Indiana, and now he's a senior research fellow at LCC International University Institute for Philanthropy in Klaipėda, Lithuania. And well, Marty, I would say that he demonstrates in his writings both what the humanities can teach us about philanthropy and vice versa, what philanthropy can teach us about the humanities. So without further ado, Marty, the floor is yours.
Hey, well, first of all, I just want to thank Guy for inviting me and taking that leap of faith, because like I said, the role of the humanities in philanthropic studies is not widely recognized or accepted, even though the humanities were a very key part of getting the whole field off the ground in the beginning, particularly in the history department. But yeah, so I'm going to give you a presentation. It's going to be primarily based on kind of the second article that was on the required reading on the classical meaning of Philanthropia. But it's going to bring in some of the other supplementary readings that I sent to you as well, and also are on the a modern meaning of philanthropy. So I just want to warn you, we're going to be delving a lot into Plato. So please feel free to stop me at any moment and ask clarifying questions of things you might not be familiar with, and that sort of thing. And I'll definitely try and help things along. So I guess the first thing is, let me see if I can. Oh, there we go. Okay. Yeah, so just to talk about how I became interested in philanthropy, and when I say philanthropy, I don't mean interested in, giving to charity or something. I meant philanthropy as a concept, and how we think about that whole act of giving and motivations behind it and goals that we're trying to achieve and that. And so I started doing my graduate work at Indiana University at what was then the Center on Philanthropy. I was, did my undergraduate degree in political science and philosophy. And so I kind of saw philanthropy and civil society as being a kind of a part of, or an interesting part of what I studied in political theory. Just this whole idea of self-organizing communities, as opposed to these top-down, everything run by government, that really intrigued me. So when I got to the Center on Philanthropy, as it was known then, I began looking into the history of the ethics of philanthropy. But I kind of got interested in philanthropy full stop. Because when you're looking at theories of ethical theories of philanthropy, it's like, well, okay, what are the referent terms? And so, there's philanthropy, charity, benevolence, liberality, so on. There's a whole laundry list of different terms we use. And so I was specifically interested in philanthropy, and I started researching these texts going back, hundreds, thousands of years. And, the current meaning that we have for philanthropy, which is basically charitable giving, that's really only a meaning of philanthropy that came into vogue in the kind of early 20th century. Before that, philanthropy had a completely different meaning. And this really intrigued me. And so I became interested in studying the history of the meaning of philanthropy as a term. And so I exhaustively researched its historical definitions and usage in primarily in English and ancient Greek. And well, I just want to kind of bring in a little Nietzsche reference here. This is from the Gay Science, which I was kind of reading at the time that I was doing this research, and I came across this gem of a quote. This has caused me the greatest trouble, and still does always cause me the greatest trouble, to realize that what things are called is unspeakably more important than what they are. And that really set me off, because it kind of underlined to me, we're studying this thing called philanthropy, but really the referent term that we use to frame that has a history and a background that imbues that whole study with a level of meaning. I also want to take another quote from Nietzsche's Gay Sciences, which is, he kind of makes an observation that every specialist has this kind of hump, and but it's still better than a literature who's a generalist and just represents everything. So I want to show you my hump. This is going to be my deformation in my character and my academic makeup. So I hope you won't be too repulsed. So anyway, philanthropy as a signified and a signifier in English. So yeah, like I was saying, we have philanthropy. We have this act of giving, charitable, and it goes by a number of different names: philanthropy, charity, beneficence, generosity, liberality, tzedakah, zakat. And those all, in one sense or another, signify the act of giving. But then in philanthropy, in terms of the history of the word, it really has a lot of different shades of meaning. Everything from God's love for man, which kind of in the English sense actually derives from the Bible. There's the passage from Titus, Paul's letter to Titus. There's the idea of philanthropy as humanity, which was actually the primary definition of philanthropy in kind of early modern English. And philanthropy as a habit of goodness, as natural sympathy, as voluntary will, as an act of giving, and as sociability. These are all kind of aspects of philanthropy that I cover in the article on the meaning of philanthropy. But the main point, though, is philanthropy is what's called a polysemy, which is that word with multiple related meanings. And of course, the act of giving has many other signifiers, which is to say synonyms. But the meaning of philanthropy has undergone significant semantic drift over the course of its history as a word, which is to say that which philanthropy signifies has changed. And these changes in what philanthropy signifies have evolved along a discernible historic trajectory that reflects reflects dominant philosophical, cultural, and social trends. So, in terms of taking a deep dive into philanthropia in ancient Greek, I did kind of some preliminary kind of hard data research. There's something that's called the Thesaurus Lingua Graeca, which is basically a digital database of everything that was ever written in Greek that is still extant today. And you can do word searches in it. And I plugged in the one for philanthropy and its close cognates, and came up with this chart, which is documents every use of philanthropy from the 6th century BC to which is the kind of the beginning of classical Greece, to the 16th century, which of course is the end of the Byzantine Empire. This is interesting to me because we have this big spike in the 4th and 5th century AD. That is almost entirely due to the work of one man, Johannes Chrysostomus, who was an early church father, saint, and archbishop of Constantinople, and he employs philanthropy in 3,052 times in his 700 sermons and 246 letters that are preserved. So this chart, while it's useful, it's kind of a happenstance of what is preserved, happens to be preserved. Johannes Chrysostomus happens to have a lot of stuff preserved, and he used Philanthropia a lot, particularly, in the Byzantine area. This idea of philanthropy, Christ as a philanthropist was very much in vogue. But we'll go to the next slide, which is another search that I did from the Persis project. So this is kind of a collaborative
Marty,
online.
Marty.
What's that? Yeah.
No, I just want to emphasize what you just said. I'm not sure everybody got that. That Jesus Christ was a Christus considered Jesus Christ a philanthropist. Like that's how he called him.
Absolutely, yes.
For his love of man, like the godly love, the God's love for man. That's within early Christianity. Yeah, I just
Right.
wanted to emphasize that because I think that's kind of it's a startling thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go on.
So this occurrence of philanthropy derived from the Perseus project. So the Perseus project is this project to put online all the kind of I mean, not just Greek, but Roman and Arabic and a lot of other languages as well. But the primary focus is ancient Greek, and they've got a search function. But they tend to put on the works that are kind of of current interest to classical scholars. So people like Plato and Demosthenes and Plutarch and things like that. So this is kind of a chart of Philanthropia in authors that are still kind of relevant interest. I've been very hard pressed to find a lot of articles written on Johannes Chrysostomus. So I have come across one recently though, and I'll like to report back on that. But here we see a couple of different spikes. One is in the 4th century BC, and then we have this kind of spike in the 1st century AD. The 4th century AD, that or BC, that's largely stemming from Demosthenes, who is a 4th century Attic Athenian order. Um, employs the word philanthropy 71 times in his extant speeches and letters. So he accounts for, almost half of all of the currents of philanthropy in the 4th century. And then in the 1st century, most of that is derived from Plutarch, who was a Middle Platonist philosopher who employs the word philanthropy 292 times in his extant works. So that's all well and good, but I'm a big subscriber to this philosophy. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's the essence of something. You can find it in its origin, and so I was really interested in what was happening here in the 6th and 5th century. And after doing a bit of research, I found actually that the references to Philanthropia in the 6th and 6 of them in the 5th century were actually spurious works that were attributed to those authors in later centuries, so not authentic. So actually, there's only 3 extant instances from the 5th century that use the word. So that was kind of my square one, starting out with my research on this topic. There they didn't have many dictionaries back in ancient times, but they did have a few, and then they did have a lot of references to meanings of words in Greek literature. So in my research, I was able to find 3 formal definitions of philanthropia. And these are kind of interesting in their own right. One is by Pseudo Plato, which was basically the students of the academy, Plato's academy in the late 4th century, who put together a dictionary of significant philosophical terms, mostly to help students understand how the words were being employed in Plato. And then we have Aulus Gellius in the 2nd century, and then Diogenes Laertius in the 3rd century. So I'm going to start with Diogenes Laertius. So he says philanthropy is of 3 kinds. One is by way of salutations, when we meet people and address them in the street, and just basic friendliness. Another one is seen when one is given to assisting everyone in distress. So, here we're getting kind of closer to kind of our modern senses of philanthropy as a form of charity. And then another mode of philanthropy is that which makes certain people fond of giving dinners or like symposia or something like that. So, just basically this gregariousness, friendliness, sociability, kindness. This is the meaning of philanthropy. Ironically, this is actually in Diogenes's book, The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, in his book on Plato, which it's ironic because we'll get to the Plato's definition of philanthropy, which actually diverges from Diogenes quite a bit. And then we have Aulus Gellius. So he says, those who have spoken Latin and have used the language correctly do not give the word humanitas the meaning which it is commonly thought to have, namely what the Greeks call philanthropia, signifying a kind of friendly spirit and good feeling towards all men without distinction. But they gave to humanitas about the force of the Greek paideia, that is what we call eruditionem institutemique in Buenos Aires. My Latin is terrible, or education and training in the liberal arts. So Aulus Gellius is basically saying, people who equate humanitas and philanthropia, they don't have it right because humanitas is more dignified. It's, it signifies education and training in the liberal arts. Whereas philanthropia, it's just kind of this friendliness and sociability. The irony is actually in the ancient Greek, in the classical Greek, in Plato, what we're going to find is that is actually the definition of philanthropy, this idea of education and training in the liberal arts. So that brings us to pseudo-Plato. And so we have four different definitions within here. One is a state of well-educated habits stemming from love of humans. Euagogos ethos. Ethos meaning habit or character, which we derive the word ethics from, and euagogos, well-educated. A state of being productive of benefit to humans. So euergetike. Anyone who's ever read Paul Venn's Bread and Circuses? Anybody? Classic. There we go. Ilana, thank you. Yeah,
I even wrote about it.
Oh, you did? Oh, great. Well, this is where well, I won't say this particular text, but this is where he drives the idea of euergetism, which is a big concept that he uses to describe this kind of obligatory good works that the ruling classes were expected to perform in the state of their social class. And then we have a state of grace, and then mindfulness together with good works. So I really think that these are evocative definitions that really harken back to a 5th century Greek usage, but also how the word is being employed in Plato. And then I've got this chart taken from the article, which is basically showing. So not only did philanthropy undergo semantic drift in English from being the love of God for man and humanitas to the modern situation of philanthropy as charitable giving. There was also a very similar semantic drift that took place in the historical development of classical Greek. And I've got it categorized here in terms of modes of usage. Of course, there aren't many definitions to go to trace the meaning of the word, and so I was kind of reduced to just categorizing it according to the referent term that philanthropy was describing. So theological means it was in reference to a god. Of course, Prometheus is the primary one, the first one, but also Hermes, Eros, and there are some other divine figures that are named as man-loving, human-loving. But then there's also a philosophical mode, which is basically philanthropy used in reference to knowledge, and in reference to education, teaching, paideia, and the knower. And that was another category. And then we have the political mode, which is in reference to rulers, magistrates, officials, and basically people holding some sort of public office. And then there's an ontological mode, which basically refers to the nature of things as inherently being philanthropic. Xenophon actually is one of the pioneers of this mode, and in one of his works on hunting, talks about the philanthropy of dogs, which he considers bad, and then in another on horses, he talks about the philanthropy of horses, which is actually good. Philanthropy of dogs is bad because they're like you know trying to get attention from their master rather than going off and hunting the prey. And the philanthropy of horses is good because it's good to have a nice friendly relationship with your horse if you're going to be doing some equestrian activities. And then we have the social mode of philanthropy, which is getting into what Diogenes was talking about: this friendliness, sociability, kindness, wanting to throw dinner parties for people. And then the fiduciary, which is kind of getting to what our modern conception of philanthropy is, which is basically donating money or resources to between various entities. And that's a very rare occurrence in the fourth century, but or in the fourth century, but there are a couple of isolated cases. Actually in Demosthenes, it's actually even ironic. It's not really until later in papyri and inscriptions that you get philanthropia used to honor big donors. It was in more as an honorific, that they had the grace of a Prometheus or something like that in their gift giving. So that's kind of a brief history of the word in ancient Greek, or chart showing its development anyway. So, like I said, I'm kind of a one of those guys who really thinks if you want to know something about something, you look at its origins. And the earliest occurrence of philanthropia in ancient Greek literature, by quite a margin, is found in Prometheus Bound. And in the prologue of that play, Prometheus is condemned by both Cratos and Hephaestus for his philanthropos tropos, which is his philanthropic character. And this is uh, what did Prometheus, as the first philanthropist, signify? Well, why is he called philanthropist? Well, because he stole fire from the gods and gave it to human beings. And what's interesting though is as you read the play and get into it, and particularly to the central episode of the play, the Prometheus's gift of fire is shown to be kind of like just a general metaphor for Prometheus first implanting mind and reason in human beings, and then discovering and teaching them all the human arts. Everything from language to mathematics to house building to shipbuilding to medicine, to all the way down through to modes of worship and that sort of thing. So basically, Prometheus is this. They call him cultural hero, I guess. He's the creator of culture in human society, in human civilization, and actually is the reason we were elevated from the level of savages to the level of civilization that we are, was through the gifts of Prometheus. So I became really interested in this in Prometheus, and this became the primary subject of my dissertation. I set out to learn everything I could about the Promethean myth, and boy, is there a lot to learn, I have to tell you. So I'm only going to touch on the part here that is regarding Prometheus Bound, and then kind of going forward. But there's actually a whole prehistory of the Promethean myth, going back. Well, actually, you can actually trace it back to uh, Indo-European. Like there's cognate myths of the Promethean myth, for instance, in Old Sanskrit, for instance. And there's a bit of a debate in the or was a lot of debate in the scholarly community as to whether those cognates were actual or not. But my research kind of bears out that they are, and that being the case, you can trace back the existence of a Promethean myth in one form or another to the separation of the Greco-Aryan Greeks and Aryans in the mid fourth millennium BC. So very ancient myth, and very significant. But with Prometheus Bound, we have a very radical retelling of the myth, and so I'd like to maybe just get into that. Now, as another thing that really kind of surprised me is, and maybe this will surprise you if any of you Greek literature aficionados, Prometheus Bound was not actually written by Aeschylus. And when I started my research, this was kind of a novel, still kind of a novelty. If we take the Wikipedia conventional wisdom approach to it. When I started my research, this idea that Aeschylus was not the author was nowhere in the Wikipedia entry on Prometheus or Prometheus Bound. But then over the course of the last decade or two, it slowly has creeped in, and now there's an acknowledgement. Well, there's a very good chance that it was written by a later, lesser author. My own uh, research is based on basically two main authors, Mark Griffith, who did his dissertation at Berkeley University on the authenticity of the Prometheus Bound, and did an exhaustive word analysis of poetic style, meter, word use, that sort of thing, comparing the other extant plays of Aeschylus, and the plays of Sophocles and Euripides to Prometheus Bound, and just absolutely unequivocal evidence that the person who wrote that was in the milieu of Euripides and Sophocles rather than Aeschylus. This kind of was backed up by, not kind of, it was backed up by Martin West, who was a dean of classics at Oxford for many years until he died just a few years ago. And he published an article, The Prometheus Trilogy, in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, in which he basically supplements Griffith's linguistic analysis with historic evidence in terms of when this play could have possibly been staged. He came up with sometime in the early 430s. And my own thinking about this is that it's very likely that it premiered in 438. And the reason I think that is because there is this, like I say, this central episode of the Promethean myth where Prometheus's gift of fire is shown to be a metaphor for this gift of knowledge and discovery and teaching of knowledge. And in the East Frieze of the Parthenon, there is a very famous sculpture now in the British Museum, that is a depiction of the gods of the Greek pantheon, and in an absolutely brilliant analysis of those sculptures that was done by Ira Mark in an article, "The Gods on the East Frieze of the Parthenon." He basically makes the claim that this representation of the gods is done in such a way to represent what we're talking about, these various techne, and how they contributed to the cultivation of civilized humanity. And he comes to the conclusion that these were influenced by Protagoras. who I think we're going to be talking a bit about here in a little minute. Um, and but I'll get to that. But this was a revelation to me as well, that Prometheus Bound is the first instance of philanthropy in Greek literature, and it slowly began to dawn on me, actually, right at the time that I was writing these articles on the meaning of philanthropy, that basically Prometheus Bound or the Promethea trilogy that it belongs to, is basically a mythological presentation of the philosophy of Protagoras. So, my conclusions: Prometheus Bound is an understood mythological presentation of the philosophy of Protagoras, and Prometheus is an allegorical representation of the sophist. Like Prometheus, sophists were consummate educators and discoverers of knowledge, and the essence of the sophist philanthropia is his paideia, his teaching to his students, and how he does it. Um, I'd like to jump now to my mentor and a absolute living legend, Dr. Lawrence Lampert, who was, in my humble opinion, the world's greatest Nietzsche scholar. He's also written extensively on Leo Strauss, Plato, and Francis Bacon. And in the process, he has made accessible what he calls the new history of philosophy that was made possible by Nietzsche, and and particular by Nietzsche's interpretation of the Western philosophical tradition, and in particular Nietzsche's how to say, suspicious reading of the philosophers, and this recognition of an esoteric and exoteric aspects to their philosophies. And this is something that's very much picked up in Leo Strauss. If anybody is familiar with Leo Strauss, that was a hallmark of his interpretive hermeneutics of the philosophers, was a recognition that there was an exoteric teaching that philosophers put out there for more general consumption, both to edify, but also to protect, provide a shelter for philosophy, and then an esoteric teaching, which was kind of more the true teaching of the philosopher, but that had potential harmful effects if just blurted out loud to the general public. So I included a chapter for you folks in the supplemental readings from Nietzsche and Modern Times, and you know, uh, I read that book when I first started attending IU. I was talking with the head of the philosophy department and telling him my interests. I'm interested in Plato and Strauss, and yeah, he said, "Oh my gosh, you have to meet this Lawrence Lampert fellow." And so he took me and introduced me, and Dr. Lampert gave me this book that he had recently published, within the last 5 or 6 years. Um, Nietzsche in Modern Times, a study of Bacon, Descartes, and Nietzsche. And in it, he extensively analyzes the philosophical philanthropy of Friedrich Nietzsche, Francis Bacon, and Plato. And this was a revelation to me because, up to then, I've been thinking of the philosophical study as basically being like a subset of ethics, the ethics of, giving and charity and that sort of thing. What Dr. Lampert's book revealed to me was that considerations of philanthropy are an absolute core element of some of the greatest philosophers in the history of the Western tradition. So I was hooked after that, and especially since I had studied Plato previously and was already a great lover of him. So, but this kind of brings us to a bit of a problem. It's like, well, how do you read Plato? I mean, there's so many words, and he says so many things, and a lot of them contradict one another, and a lot of them kind of go around and argue around in circles, and just what's going on here? And there's a kind of a modern tendency to try and slot authors into genres. So what is Plato doing? Is he writing philosophy? Well, of course, a lot of people, if he's a philosopher, he's writing philosophy. He writes writes philosophical arguments, but they're in a dramatic form. And so how do you square that? It's not actually ever Plato saying anything. It's characters in his dramas and his dialogues that are saying the things. So you can't really say, well, this is what Plato believed. It's just what he put down in somebody else's mouth. And then history, is it historic? And by and large, the in the philosophical tradition has tended to dismiss the historical aspect of Plato's dialogues, but we'll get back to that. And then pedagogy, of course, we know that Plato used his dialogues in the academy basically as instructional tools, and they very much would have contained his exoteric teachings, teachings that were salutary to his audience. But in there, you might find some gems that might lead you to things that Plato actually believed. And then biography. Very much it is they are by and large a biography of Socrates, and more than just a biography. There's what the Greeks called an apologia, which is not an apology, but it's an explanation of why Socrates was the way he was. And then, of course, Plato being an absolute master of the written form, there is no reason in my mind why he couldn't be doing all one, two, three, four, five, six of those at the same time. And that's kind of my operating assumption that Plato is a talented enough guy that he can really roll on all those different levels at the same time. So, in terms of the philosophical tradition, there's a number of methods of ordering Plato's dialogues. And when I say ordering them, I mean, kind of ordering them in a way that kind of makes sense of their kind of contradictory nature. So the first is to arrange them thematically or pedagogically according to themes or of what they're dealing with. So that was the tact taken by Thrasyllus back in the first, who was the editor of the first definitive edition of the Plato's Dialogues back in the Greco-Roman era. And then there's been like numerous attempts to order the dialogues, groupings, and Thrasyllus did them in what they call tetralogies to kind of reflect the structure of a trilogy. So you have the three plays, and then you have the Satyr play at the end of it. So four plays. So Thrasyllus did it in kind of a series of four dialogues. But then in the 19th century, German scholars got a hold of the ideas and started to say, well, there's a lot of contradictions in Plato's dialogues, but that's because he was writing them over a period of time, and over time, people um, change their ideas, change their mind, and so these contradictions in his dialogues are a reflection of the fact that he had to change of heart in some of his ideas, and later dialogues, change them to reflect that kind of in a Wittgensteinian moment. Um, so that has been actually the predominant way of approaching the interpretation of Plato's dialogues as a whole, right down to the current day. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is the dramatic dating. Now, that has really only taken off here in the last few years. But as far back as 1926 with A.E. Taylor in his Plato, the Man and His Work, he starts to use the dramatic datings. There are a lot of the dialogues that have very apparent dramatic datings to them. You think of like the Socrates Apology or the Phaedo, and that, which are all grouped around his trial and execution in 399. So those are very obvious. Some other dialogues are a little more tricky in terms of figuring it out, but an educated person can do it. But then I would say a third of them kind of fall into that category. A third of them fall into well, there isn't really a clear date. And then another third, the dates, the apparent dates are actually contradictory or uh, achronological, because Plato allegedly has, various characters or events happening that couldn't have happened together. So we'll get into a little of that, but the start in modern scholarship of using the dramatic datings as an interpretive hermeneutic begins with A.E. Taylor. It picks up quite a bit of steam with Deborah Nails in 2002. She published The People of Plato, a prosopography of Plato and other Socratics, which basically she goes through all of the characters that appear in Plato and actually in Xenophon as well, and goes through all of the extant biographical information we have for them, and so does a little biography and when they lived and all of that sort of thing. And her work is great because it's basically a summation of the conventional wisdom about all of these up to that point in time. And then Catherine Zucker kind of takes her work and actually writes a interpretation of Plato's dialogues based on the dramatic dates as Deborah Nails presents them. The problem is Deborah Nails and Catherine Zucker are basically just going off the conventional wisdom of the dating, which is what I explained to you. There's some that we know for sure, some that are a little hazy, and then some that are absolutely contradictory. So how do you square that circle? Well, I'll tell you how. You dedicate your life to uncovering the dramatic date of Plato's dialogues, and you do so because it's the only indication that Plato himself gives as to how to order the dialogues, as opposed to, grouping them thematically or in the order of composition, which there is no indication that Plato had that in mind. But he did actually provide clues in his dialogues as to dramatic dating, and Christopher Plano, who actually is another student of Lawrence Lampert. So he caught the bug back in the early 90s and went on to do a degree in graduate degree in classics at Cambridge University. But he's basically made it his life's work to unlock the dramatic dating of all Plato's dialogues. Uh, and I shouldn't say all of Plato's Socratic dialogues. He's kind of put aside the laws because he just doesn't enjoy reading it that much, I guess. I don't know. So I've kind of undertook it myself to provide a dramatic dating for that one. But before he could do that, he had to basically work out, well, how did the Athenians construct their calendars? Because that's going to be the absolute key to unlocking dramatic dating of the dialogues. Because a lot of the dialogues, a lot of them, they're set close to or around various festivals, various competitions, dramatic competitions, and such. So that for instance, the symposium takes place after the great Dionysus, or the Panathenaea competition. But when did that happen? Well, okay, so we don't really know, and there hasn't really been a consensus around this issue. There was a great conflict between two scholars, Merritt and Pritchett, over the 20th century, that was never resolved. Chris has resolved it, and he came out just this last year with the Athenian Primer, Attic Time Reckoning, and the Julian Calendar. It's going to be following that up with another book that is, so of course, if you're going to analyze Athenian time, you have to also analyze Athenian money, and because Athenians were very punctilious about lending money and interest and over time, and so he's doing another book on that. And then once he's got that groundwork, well, he's already working on the definitive dating of all the Plato's dialogues. but he needs to have that other work put to bed before he can come out with that book, because of course scholars can jump up and poke holes and everything if you don't have all your I's crossed and T's dotted. So, but of course, Chris has been doing this research meantime, and he's a student of Dr. Lampert. Actually, he's the one who actually typed out in WordStar Nietzsche in Modern Times back in 1993. So him and Dr. Lampert have a very long history. But Dr. Lampert has been incorporating the findings of Chris's research extensively in his own writings on Plato. And the first really big one was how philosophy became Socratic. And in it, he correctly situates the contested dramatic dates of Protagoras, Charmides, and Republic. The Protagoras and Republic are two of those dialogues that are supposedly anachronistic, that they have conflicting dramatic dates. So, the Republic is dated as late as 411 in some cases, and then everything in between. Chris was the first to argue that it actually occurs in 429. And that was primarily on the basis of a discovery that was made in Athens in the 1930s of a stela, which is basically a column, big stone column with inscriptions on it that marked the celebration of the first festival of Bendis, which was a Thracian goddess that was introduced to Athens in 429. And of course, we know from the beginning of the Republic that Socrates and Glaucon went down to the Piraeus to look at the festival celebrations of the goddess that was going to be celebrated for the first time. And later in the dialogue, we discover that that goddess is Bendis, and on that basis, um, uh, Chris argues that that is the dramatic setting of the Republic. Now, in the one of the supplementary readings I gave to you, kind of on the recovering the wisdom of Protagoras, actually Chris's has a chapter immediately before that where he does the dramatic dating of the Republic, not on the basis of the stela, but on the basis of the characters that appear in the Republic and squaring those with a date of 429. And what he cutting to the chase, what he comes up with is there is no absolute contradiction between them. There's a couple of stretches that you have to make, but they're all within the realm of possibility. So 429, Protagoras, 434. Again, there's some, and I'll get to that. But the real significance of this, though, is that we have Socrates and Protagoras arguing that we need to have the sophists should be teaching this philosophy basically of utilitarianism, that wisdom is the maximizing of pleasure over the long term, and that we have to present philosophy in that way to the public. And so a lot of people are kind of scratching their head about that. It's like, oh, Socrates is a utilitarian. But in the Gorgias, he comes out absolutely against utilitarianism, and so, but what we have to understand is this is an exoteric teaching, and then Socrates goes off to fight the war in Potidaea, comes back in 429, and gets off the boat, and first thing he goes to the Palaestra, and that's where the Charmides takes place. And Socrates looks at the state of philosophy, and he's despondent because one of his close followers, Critias, has turned out to be how to say, a unguarded speaker of the truth, and so Socrates is kind of the opinion, maybe we need to reformulate this. And what Chris's work has done is it basically shows that Charmides happens just 2 weeks before the Republic, and the Republic is where Socrates unveils this whole idea of the forms, and that you know that these forms basically act as I mean, this he doesn't say this, but basically act as a substitute for the dying Homeric gods that were coming into disbelief in Athens. So in this masterpiece of philosophical interpretation, Protagoras is restored to his rightful place in ancient Greek philosophy. Lampert highlights the role of esotericism and exotericism in ancient Greek philosophy, and he points to the significance of the Promethean myth in Plato's Protagoras. Unfortunately, my work on my dissertation wasn't near mature enough for him to incorporate those ideas into this work. A fact that he lamented to me at one point, but then he did write How Socrates Became Socrates, and again traces the early, and now this one. So this is how philosophy became Socratic, and that's how Socrates reformed philosophy with this theory of forms and all of the ideas that went into it. But this book is How Socrates Became Socrates, and so he traces Socrates' early philosophical development from, well, passing references in Phaedo and Symposium, but then Parmenides is actually it's a whole dialogue, but the dramatic frame of it is actually set in the 390s. But the main action of it takes place in 415, around the time of a great Panathenaea. And what's interesting is the that Parmenides definitively disprove, because Socrates is coming up to Parmenides is like, well, Parmenides, I've got this great theory. It's a theory of forms, and that there's kind of transcendent ideas of good and the just and the virtuous and this sort of thing, and Parmenides basically takes Socrates out to the woodshed and gives him a sound thrashing, showing how these ideas are basically logically unsupportable. And yet, uh, we have Socrates in 429 going and presenting this idea of the forms as basically being the framework for his establishment of the perfectly just regime in speech. So another interesting lesson in esotericism, exotericism, that Socrates is presenting a teaching he knows to be untrue, logically unsupportable, but persuadable. He can persuade people of it, and he can use it to construct a political theory. It also shows, Lampert also shows how Socrates' eulogy of Eros and Symposium, set in 416, or the main dramatic action, contains the essence of his ontology, that the nature of being is essentially Eros, which is to say, is um, this persistent knowledge we have of humans of lacking something, that we're always in a state of poverty, trying to gather resources, and that this is the essential nature of our being, our eros. Okay, finally getting around to Philanthropia. So, okay, so like I said, there's a couple of ways of approaching interpretation of Plato's dialogues. We have the date of composition. Plato composed them into early, middle, and late dialogues. And it's funny because the dramatic date of them is almost the exact opposite of the date, supposed date of composition. The one composition that we do know was the last thing that Plato ever wrote, was the Laws, and we know that because Aristotle makes reference to it, that when Plato died, there were still tablets, wax tablets, that Plato had inscribed the pages of the laws that were supposed to be transcribed onto vellum or papyrus or whatever. So we do know for certain the Laws was the last. The rest of them, I think it's kind of a questionable. But in terms of dramatic date, we have the laws, which I situate sometime between 443 and 433. I have reasons for that, and I'm happy to talk about them, but time might be running short here, so I'll cut to the Protagoras in 434, Symposium in 416, although the dramatic date is 399, Euthyphro 399, and then Phaedo 399, but the dramatic frame is 391. So in laws, the Athenian stranger says, we don't make cattle themselves rulers of cattle or goats rulers of goats. Instead, we exercise our despotic dominion over them because our species is better than theirs. The same was done by the god who is philanthropic. He set over us the better species of daemons who supervised us in a way that provided much ease both for them and for us. So in the laws, the Athenian stranger is conversing with two old men, Cleinias the Cretan and Megellus the Spartan, who are looking to found a new city. But the Athenian stranger says, in establishing authority in a city, one must invoke the name of a god who truly rules as a despot over those who possess intellect. And who is this god? He then goes on to tell a myth of Kronos, who he describes as having been philanthropic for ruling over humans via daemons during a mythic golden age of humanity. Shortly thereafter, he says this phrase, there can be no rest from evils and toils for those cities in which some mortal rules rather than a god. What I find interesting about that phrase is it's an almost exact paraphrase of a very key moment in the Republic, where they've just constructed this Cydian speech for Glaucon and Adeimantus, and Glaucon's like, "Wow, Socrates, that city sounds great. How can we bring it into being?" And Socrates is like, well, you're probably not going to enjoy what I'm going to say, but there will be no rest from ills in the city until philosophers rule or rulers truly philosophize. So what the Athenian stranger, in my interpretation, is saying is not that there needs to be some god that's ruling over the city in order for it not to be miserable, but a philosopher. And when I say a philosopher, I don't mean, some guy in your academic department who teaches philosophy. I'm talking philosopher with a capital P. And so, and in that sense,
And that
the
would be,
Athenian strain,
Marty, that would be a philanthropic philosopher, right? Like
yeah,
someone who's,
a philanthropic, platonic, political philosopher. And actually the Athenian stranger is actually acting in this mode in terms of, he is the philosopher and he's teaching Megillus and what the Cleinias, giving them the laws that they will take to found their cities. So he's acting as the Kronos that's sending down the daemons to found the cities that will be just and well ordered and free from the ills that
and this
uh,
this relates to the modes, right? To the modes of the use of philanthropy. And I'm asking this also because I want to lead to some questions from the audience and to see that we can get a discussion going about the meaning of philanthropy, the significance of philanthropy.
mhm,
I mean, I don't want we have until like 5:30, and I want to get some discussion going.
mhm.
Uh, so
Well, I can kind of flash through the rest of them and then get to a discussion if that works.
yeah, let's
Yeah.
let's try to see the significance of this for philanthropy. And I mean, you really demonstrated the significance of philanthropy for classical studies here, and a few other things as well. Let's see that we can have a discussion with the audience about what really intrigues. Okay.
Yeah, well, I'll just kind of run through really quickly. There's another passage in Laws where he talks about how people become misanthropic by extreme savage enslavement. In Protagoras, we have the Protagoras referring to the chorus of misanthropes in Pericrates' comedy Agrioi, who leave the city in disgust at the injustice of men, but then find themselves among savages who make even the most wicked, silly dwellers seem just by comparison. Incidentally, this is actually one of the key anachronistic features, supposedly anachronistic features of Protagoras, that's actually a chief part of my research right now is disproving that. And then in Symposium, Aristophanes describes Eros as the most philanthropic of the gods, a helper of human beings, as well as a physician dealing with an illness, the healing of which would result in the greatest happiness for the human race. Euthyphro, Socrates tells Euthyphro, the Homeric priest who's taking his father to trial for manslaughter. Perhaps you seem to make yourself available only infrequently and not to be willing to teach your wisdom, but I feel that because of my philanthropists seem to them to pour out whatever I possess to every man, not only without pay, but even with pleasure, if anyone is willing to listen to me. What's interesting about this too is this is the first extant instance of philanthropy in the noun form. So it's not that Socrates is philanthropic. Philanthropy is integral to his being. And then in the Phaedo, in his death in the moments leading up to his death, Socrates tells his gathered friends, hatred of human beings, misanthropia arises from artlessly trusting somebody to excess and believing that human to be in every way true and sound and trustworthy, and then a little later discovering that this person is wicked and untrustworthy, and then having this experience again. So Socrates' philanthropy on this last day is rescuing his friend from what he considers the greatest evil, which is misanthropy, which is kind of the Latin translation of that is nihilism, this loss of faith in reason, which I have to say resonates with our current situation quite a bit. Maybe we could use a little rescuing. So anyway, in conclusion, Philanthropia reflects 5th century thought on political constitution and rule, on civil society, on ontology, the nature of the philosophy, and preserving the logos and preventing mythology. That all of these supposed differences in terms of the theological, philosophical, and political in the early usage of philanthropy, they're all one. It's just that the theological was a metaphorical application of these ideas to political and philosophical realms. And the philosophical realms is the political philosopher. This one that is specifically interested in the city is the philanthropic philosopher. So the implications for the study of philanthropy nowadays, I know we're all about relevance and what this means for us. So philosophers establish the horizons within which society interprets the world. And these horizons delineate the nature of the public good, for example, education, religion, science. And I don't mean that, they don't, it's not that education, religion, and science didn't exist before those horizons were delineated, but those horizons delineated it in such a way that education could become more than just a one-on-one affair, that it could become a social activity, and that religion was more than just somebody going in his backyard doing a sacrifice and saying prayer, and becomes a organized activity. And then in science, with Bacon's reform of the sciences, it isn't just some astrologer working away in his alchemy in the basement. It's a cooperative venture between many scientists who communicate. So, and then definitions of the public good in turn determine what is philanthropic. So we talk about voluntary action for the public good. Well, who determines what is good? Well, I would say that the horizons established by these various political philosophers have established those horizons that lead us to these conclusions. Of course, we have nowadays this idea that philanthropy shouldn't yeah, we should leave out that good part because it's too normative and it's not very scientific. That we should just define philanthropy as private giving to public purposes and just leave it at that. But I think Plato might have something to say about that. So that's my presentation. I'm glad to turn it over for discussion now and questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marty. I mean, you showed some cutting edge research on Plato, Plato's dialogues, and the relevance of philanthropy, the concept of philanthropy to all that, and the importance of the concept of philanthropy for understanding ancient classical society as well. Well, we didn't even really reach the discussion about the current society and the way that these drifts in meanings, what causes them, and what can we understand from them. Maybe that's a subject for a whole course. But I would like to open the floor to questions from the group, and so please, if anybody has a question. Here is Ilana. Go ahead.
Marty, maybe you can stop
got it.
sharing your screen and we can see each other more clearly.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Oh, there we go. Stop share. There we go.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so who was it? I mean, Ilana, you had a question? Or was it Galia?
Ilana could go first, sure.
Okay.
You're on mute.
Ilana, you're on mute. Ilana, you're on mute.
Thank you for this overwhelming experience. For me, it was going back to my years in high school in France, studying Greek and Latin and so on. So it's very emotional. But I just want to ask one question because I'm sure there are lots of questions in terms of rather thinking of words in terms of their semantic connotations. Was there at some point, it's a word that I didn't encounter in your frame, in your maps, in your typologies of modes and orientations, does it connect, did you encounter the theme of a generosity? Does philanthropia acquire a connotation of generosity at some point?
Well, yes. I mean, it does. I guess it's how that generosity manifests itself. I mean, Socrates is certainly the model for the philosophical dimension of it, which is, like he says to Euthyphro, I'm willing to pour out everything I know without even being paid, just for the pleasure of just if somebody is willing to hear me or listen to me. And so yeah, that speaks to me very much to a generosity of spirit, this willingness to share one's knowledge with others. But then, it gets picked up in later, because after Plato, everyone wants to be like Socrates. So because he's like the martyr to philosophy and the model for philanthropic behavior. So it becomes a kind of an honorific, and it gets applied to a lot of different aspects. Socrates also liked to go to drinking parties, and so we have a social mode of philanthropy. But yeah, but there's a whole range
Was
of
there a word for generosity? Was there a word for that?
One of the ones that in classical Greek is charis, which is actually encapsulated in the Platonic definition of philanthropy. And charis, it's basically used to mean basically grace. Like if a person moved gracefully, but then it kind of got incorporated in I think like the 6th century or so to indicate social graces, so that you are you are graceful in your acts of giving, but also in terms of your returning of favors and that sort of thing. So yeah, charis is one of the main ones, but there's a whole lexicon of terms in ancient Greek that refer to this. And then particularly when you get to Plato, or sorry, in Aristotle, in Nicomachean Ethics, he has a list of different virtues that he says contribute toward the good life, and a good 4 or 5 of them have to do with generosity. Megalopropia, megalotsukia, eleutheriotes, and then there's another one that it's not actually a word, it's a phrase, but I can't say that right now. But yeah, there's a whole lexicon of different words. Actually, I've written a unpublished paper on that subject if if you're ever interested.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mhm.
Galia.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. First of all, for this very enriching tour, I would say, into the process of the research here, which is very thoughtful and robust. I actually have a clarifying question. It might be very simple to reply, but in your last slide, you talk about the horizons, right? The horizons as defining the public goods, and then the
Mhm.
public goods defining philanthropy. And that's a
Mhm.
leap I don't fully understand, because we tend to think of philanthropy as private action or giving or whatever towards public goods, but public goods could be attained or validated through public means as well. So how is the leap? How is it move from public goods into philanthropy done in the process, right? In the process of research.
In the process of research, or in the process of society, and how these goods get, or how they get enacted in terms of being a public good.
I'm interested in where your research into the ancient Greek concepts of philanthropy collide, right, with the idea that philanthropy is a means to public good.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think we're in defining public goods, we're kind of dependent on a kind of a background, cultural knowledge. At one time, science, for instance, was considered evil. I mean, if you were in the Middle Ages and practicing science the way science is supposed to be practiced, you were in danger of being accused of necromancy or something like that. So these horizons that establish what is good, what is evil, those frame what we consider public good. So with Bacon's reform of the public of the sciences and scientific method, I mean, he's very explicit that this reformation of the sciences is for the public weal, to relieve man's estate, to basically fulfill the promises of Christianity better than Christianity did itself, in terms of alleviating suffering and that sort of thing. So I mean, Bacon is very much making the pitch for science to be considered a public good, and reforming science in a way that it works as productive of public good. So and then the same thing could be said, for instance, of Christianity, where at one time it was regarded as an evil and something to be stamped out, and but over long, slow process of public works, establishing hospitals, or well, what they called hospitals, establishing churches that provide public services, that they inure themselves into the public good. So this is uh,
But then
where do these ideas of public good come from? I guess is the question.
But then the question is, where's the connection between philanthropy and the provision of public good? Where do they connect? I mean, we could provide public goods by different means, which are not private means, right?
Well, I mean, philanthropy is the act of providing for a public good. I mean, and even as far back as Prometheus, I mean, he was giving these gifts of knowledge, so that humans could lift themselves from the states of savagery and achieve a degree of civilization and peace. Um, so it just philanthropy is um, productive of the public good, but the definition of what that good is kind of left a bit to philosophy or to a philanthropic philosopher.
Then maybe my question is, what makes philanthropy a private act? Is Prometheus coming from a private motive, or is he responsible for the public goods because he's a god taking care of humans?
Well, Prometheus is definitely acting on his own individual initiative because he does so in defiance of Zeus, who takes away fire from human beings in the Hesiodic version anyway, and gives it to human beings and is crucified literally as a result of that. And so yeah, it's definitely philanthropy has a history going back to Prometheus of kind of going against the established order for what it perceives as being misanthropic, I guess you would call it, and not productive of the public good.
But let me jump in here. I mean, you still talk about the political mode of
Mhm,
philanthropy, which is a characteristic of rulers.
mhm.
So in that sense, there is a possible drift in meaning towards the philanthropy of the state, or what would be called the welfare state today, which is
Mhm,
that the political mode of philanthropy is actually the welfare state.
mhm. Well, I mean, a Platonic political philosopher like Socrates, like Plato, like Bacon, like Nietzsche. I mean, they're acting on private initiative, but their goal is to rule as a commander and legislator by bringing in a new sets of ideals, a new tablet of values, establishing new horizons that can reform how we're thinking about public good. So yeah, it's a private initiative, but with political ambitions, put it that way.
But in the political mode, it would still be like a characteristic of a ruler, of like a certain emperor or whoever it is, could be
Well,
philanthropic or
I mean,
misanthropic.
a political philosopher, Platonic political philosophers don't rule directly. They rule in terms of establishing ideals, establishing the gods, establishing what is held to be of highest value in society, and then letting the actual rulers do the heavy lifting, letting the Megelluses and the Clineuses actually do the dirty work of running a city. They're just providing the broad parameters within which that works. So for Plato, for instance, I mean, his ambition was to supplant the Homeric gods that he saw as basically dying, especially after the first couple of years of the Peloponnesian War. You had these youngsters, Glaucon and Adeimantus, going, oh, we kind of hear these things that the gods aren't aren't active in punishing the wicked and rewarding the just. What are we going to do? And so Socrates brings in this whole theology. In fact, the first occurrence of theology in all of Greek literature is in the Republic. and brings about this reformation of the gods that is rooted in this theory of forms. But it's a conception of God that isn't an anthropomorphized God like you have in the Greek pantheon. It's a God that is only the cause of good in the world, rewards the wicked and or rewards the just and punishes the wicked after death. And you know that this is the conception of God that actually paved the way for the Christian conception of God coming in to the Greco-Roman era.
Yeah. Did I see you, Dan? You wanted to ask a question?
Sure. Thank you, Marty. I wanted to ask you if across your studies you came into contact with maybe competing definitions or areas of interaction between Greek and other Near Eastern ideas about philanthropy from Egypt or Persia, whether in the classical text or even in the German reinterpretation in modern times, if there was any sort of effect of the interaction between them.
Well, you know, not exactly in the philosophical mode, which I'm kind of holding up as the apex of philanthropy, and then kind of our kind of later definitions kind of are the dregs of this philanthropy, the kind of the degenerative form where philanthropy is just friendliness or something. But I had another article that I was tempted to send to you that for the supplementary readings that I do get into across a wide range of cultures. So Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Islam, Chinese society, and the article's charity and comparative cross-cultural perspective. And if you're interested, I can send that along to you. But yeah, I kind of trace out this idea, more conventional idea of philanthropy as goodwill and giving. I'd be happy to forward that on to you through Guy or whatever means is necessary. But I'm quite happy with that article, I have to say. But yeah, it's ubiquitous. This idea of philanthropy now in our more conventional sense. I mean, it's all the way back to archaic societies. You know, I mean, Marcel Mauss, you know, did a great analysis of, you know, giving amongst the Polynesians and the Northwest Indians, and I mean that this is deeply embedded, and you can actually go back into anthropological or paleontological research, you know, back to the very origins of humans as humans, and this idea of food sharing and resource sharing is very, very ancient, going back literally millions of years. It's etched into our nature.
Here,
Ilana?
Ilana wants
Yeah.
to jump in.
I am tempted to bring us up to modern times. I was struck when I started to study philanthropy, and I did empirical research on what's going on in Israel, the early development of philanthropy in the modern sense of, you know, of elite philanthropy and of giving for public good, you know, private wealth for the public good. People did not know what I was talking about. I mean, the word was not known. Well, of course, it was very well known already in the United States. It's something that was taken for granted. And I'm wondering how the word philanthropy became so established within the American discourse about giving of private wealth for the public good. It's not obvious, I mean, that it was adopted as the central word. And of course,
Yeah,
knowing of England and France, as you wrote yourself in a critique of Bed Breeze, I know, you know, the word charity in England was used to cover everything instead of philanthropy. In France, you have the superb article by Arthur Gauthier on philanthropy as a contested concept. I don't know if you have seen that. it's a fascinating study of the historical development and struggles over the very idea of philanthropy and what it does. So this is what I was wondering. How did the word philanthropy become so central now? Is it, I am not sure that it's that accepted in Asia or other countries. And if it is as an import from the American scene, I think. But there is a whole study to do just about the diffusion of the concept and how it became institutionalized as the central concept, to the extent that we have now an Institute for Law and Philanthropy at Tel Aviv University, okay, among us. That's
right. Well, I have a bit of a response to that, which is that philanthropy basically came out of the late 19th century. I talked at the beginning of my lecture here how, in terms of researching the meaning of philanthropy, that there was a very big change around the turn of the 19th to 20th century that, is reflected in formal definitions of the term. Sometimes there was a bit of a time lag between common usage, and working its way into dictionaries. But it was kind of connected with this whole progressivist scientific giving, that they wanted to distinguish themselves from, and I say them, these kind of major industrialists, very wealthy individuals who had made their fortunes incorporating the findings of natural science coming out of the Enlightenment. And they wanted to use those same methodologies to address social concerns. So, Andrew Carnegie has this great essay on the Gospel of Wealth, where he talks about, how this idea of charity, we might as well have just taken all that money that we've been donating to charity and thrown it in the ocean for all the good it's done. What he wanted to do was he wanted to strategically use his philanthropy, with kind of backed by latest scientific research on to address causes rather than symptoms, and to develop independence, or independence anyway, among beneficiaries, rather than developing dependence,
But he
and
didn't take
contributing
the
to what he
word
called policy.
from the Greeks. I mean,
Well,
he didn't.
it was floating
How did
around. I
it
mean,
land in his mind? How did it land
it
and
was,
becomes
well, I mean, how did it come into English? Is that what
the
you're
word?
asking?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it came into English basically. Well, there's a long story for you. There's actually an old Saxon text that has philanthropy, but it's in reference to plants whose seeds stick to human beings. So, they love humans, so they stick to humans' clothing and stuff like that. That was actually a predominant usage all through the Middle Ages. But then there was a borrowing of the philanthropy from the Greek Bible, that was translated by Tyndale in the, let me see, 16th century, and he kind of followed Jerome's translation from the Greek into the Latin, where Jerome translated philanthropia as humanitas. So Tyndale, used there was awareness of philanthropy, but it was as a synonym for humanitas. And then we have Francis Bacon's essay, where Francis Bacon was a absolute master Greek scholar of the very first. His mother actually was a talented Greek scholar, so he literally had Greek as a mother tongue, and he understood the classics better than anybody up to that point in time. And so when he read it, and when he used it in his writings, he uses it in the classical Greek uh, sense of the word, and that's what brings it into English in the modern sense of the word, not as the love of God for man, not as humanitas, not as sticky seeds, but as this goodness, goodness of philanthropy is goodness, basically. And it's in the essay in one of the supplementary readings that I gave, where that basically that whole essay, goodness and goodness of nature, is a meditation on the meaning of philanthropy as Bacon understood it. So that's how it enters the Greek modern English. But then it gets, carried through in Johnson's dictionary and in Webster's early dictionary. But those are imbued with a lot of the kind of ideals of the Enlightenment. So philanthropy is kind of this universal goodwill toward all human beings. So it's I mean, it's a long way from sticky seeds, but it's still not this political philosopher of philanthropy we're talking about here. And then from there, it kind of gets applied to these philanthropists who are trying to reform Christian charity into something more along the lines of scientific philanthropy. And that becomes the dichotomy, and that's the model of giving that really takes root and takes over in the 20th century, where we want to have a needs assessment, and we want to have a measurable objectives, and we want to have methodologies that we're carrying out, and all of these sorts of things. Prior to that, it was just like, well, we're giving, and that's the main part. That's the main thing. We're giving to the poor and to alleviate suffering. So does that go some way to explaining how it seeped in and how it became?
I learned a lot now about the stages, but I'm still astonished that the concept took acquired such a central position, and nobody questions even the word philanthropy.
Well, I mean, it's ironic.
It's taken
I
for
was just in
granted
China.
that Carnegie was a philanthropist, but it was not taken for granted that it would catch. It seems to have gone through Diderot and the Enlightenment, and then brought back to America via the British. I don't understand that the Protestants adopted it also as a political notion. I mean, there's a whole sea of things that I would love to learn still, but thank you for this.
It's still a contest, like you say, it's a contested term even to this day. Contested in the meaning, but also contested in terms of how we should label this field that we're studying. I was just in China a couple of months ago, and there's like these institutes for philanthropy popping up over there as well, and I'm just like, well, there surely there must be some Chinese terms and of course there's the Chinese concept of Ren, which I think is very much in line with the classical Greek sense of philanthropy. It's very much also a quality of the scholar and the ruler and that sort of thing. So actually I'm working with some folks right now to establish a Ren Institute, which doesn't actually exist in China. Even though they have like at least a half a dozen philanthropy institutes. And so I don't know, maybe you need to be having a tzedakah institute or something like that.
Wow, Marty, thanks a lot. I mean, this is like really an amazing walk through a very difficult subject of the semantics of philanthropy, and you really show what can be done. I mean, it raises so many questions, and but yeah, really, thanks a lot for your meticulous work and your presentation. I saw Yehuda wanted to say something before we wrap up. No, okay. So, Galia wanted to maybe thank you.
Just to thank you again, Marty. Thank you for showing up so
Agalia.
early in the morning on your side of the ocean.
Oh, it's not so early. 9 o'clock is like
Well,
very easily done.
It's a good time to wish you a great day.
Yeah. Well, it was really a great honor for me to be able to present to you folks, and I hope one day I may even make it to Israel myself to do something in person. So,
We would love to host you.
But meanwhile, I will send that article on charity and comparative cross-cultural perspective for Guy to distribute, since there seems to be some interest in that as a subject too.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot,
you.
Marty. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.